I'm Mary Close Oppenheimer, and I'm the president of the Salisbury Forum, and we want to welcome you here tonight. I hope you move your screen to speaker view. And anyway, for anyone who is not familiar with the Salisbury Forum, we're based in the northwest corner of Connecticut, and we offer free public forums, usually between 6 and 8 a year, with people who are experts in their fields on all different kinds of topics. So if you want to be informed of our upcoming talks, please sign up for our email list by going to our website, which is salisburyforum.org. And there you can also, if you or your friends miss one of our talks, we video them all, and you can also watch some of our past talks that way. So although it's a ways from now, coming up on February 5th at 7:30, David Pogue will be our speaker. And he's a well-known technology columnist for the New York Times. He's a 5-time Emmy winner for his stories on CBS Sunday Morning, and a New York Times best-selling author and host of 20 science specials on Nova on PBS. His topic will be that of his upcoming book, How to Prepare for Climate Change. So I don't think you're going to want to miss that. Again, that is on February 5th at 7:30. Like everyone else, we have begun our annual fundraising appeal. And we depend on you, our audience, for the bulk of our funds so that we can keep these programs free to the public. So I hope you will be as generous as possible this year. And we are extremely grateful for any donations you may make. You can easily make a donation on our website, or many of you probably have received an appeal letter in the mail, and you can just write a check and send that to us. So again, thank you for your generosity for whatever you can manage to send us this year. We are very grateful, as always, to the Hotchkiss School, Salisbury School, and Housatonic Valley Regional High School. They have been our partners since our inception. We couldn't exist without them. They have hosted our talks in their auditoriums until recently. And Salisbury School and Hotchkiss have also helped us financially. And so we are grateful and want to thank them. And for a change for this talk, William Pitt Sotheby's International Realty has given us a grant which partially funds this talk. So we want to thank them for their generosity as well. Now, in this webinar format, the Q&A is going to be in our chat room. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little icon. And if you click on that, you can write in any questions you may have, and Adam will respond to them after his talk. So we are delighted to have Adam Gopnik with us tonight. He is a well-known veteran essayist and staff writer for the New Yorker magazine. He's also well known as an author of numerous books, including children's books, and my personal favorite, Paris to the Moon, which I read many years ago and still fondly remember many of the stories that are in it. So I recommend it if you haven't read it yet. And for the past 5 years, he's also engaged in many musical projects, working as both a lyricist and libretto writer. So he's quite the Renaissance man. We're very lucky to have him here. His most recent book is 1,000 Small Sanities, The Moral Adventure of Liberalism, which discusses liberal democracy, its strategy for survival, and its risks of extinction. As always, it's available at Oblong Books and Music. So I hope you will purchase a copy from them. They need your help this year during this holiday season, and it should be a great book as a holiday gift. So anyway, with that, I am just delighted to welcome Adam Gopnik to our forum this evening.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for that generous introduction. It's wonderful to be back at the Salisbury Forum. I visited in person rather than in spirit 4 years ago, and it couldn't have been a better time. I feel strongly both the absence of that engagement. I remember so well that wonderful feeling of the pre-Thanksgiving air. It really was 4 years ago. On one's skin, the leaves rustling, the whole beautiful sylvan feeling of Connecticut, which for a city boy like myself, for whom Central Park is all the wilderness we get, or need. It was thrilling. I wish I was out there again, but I am delighted to be able to join you in this remote fashion here for my study, where I have been Zooming steadily since the sky fell in and the world shut down in March. I should add, because people sometimes ask, the picture over my shoulder is a portrait of my favorite writer, James Thurber, by my favorite photographer, Richard Avedon, and I leave it there to lend a kind of tutelary presence as I talk, reminding me to try and be funny and always, if I can, to be acute. What I wanted to talk to you about tonight is, in practical and empirical terms, the election that we have just been through, or I should say we are passing through, but in broader, or perhaps I should say in deeper terms, also about the underpinnings, the foundations of liberal democracy as we watch it being stress tested so much in these past 4 years since last I spoke to Salisbury, and even more in a certain sense in these past 2 weeks when the organizers of tonight's lecture asked me what title I wanted. It's about 6 months ago. I gave them a deliberately two-pronged and doubly valent title, the end of everything or the rebirth of hope, depending on what the result of the election was. What I hadn't anticipated sufficiently is that we would have both the rebirth of hope and the end of everything, because what we've lived through, I think, since the night of the election is both, in many respects, a reaffirmation of key values, not just of liberal democracy, but of the particular vision of liberalism that I tried to describe, present, embroider, enjoin in this book. But at the same time, we've seen how profound the threats are to the liberal democracy as we watch Donald Trump continue this kind of slow motion coup, clownish in its affect. No one will soon forget the Four Seasons gardening shed or road in front of which the Rudy Giuliani's press conference was held, but at the same time, for all of its silliness, equally sinister in its unprecedented assault on the machinery, the constitutional machinery of elections. But let me come to that as we speak. Let me begin, if I may, by trying, assuming that few of you will have read the book, I hope some have, to offer you a brief summary of its contents, and particularly and most importantly, of my particular vision of what liberalism is. And let me say instantly that it is somewhat at remove both from what the common journalistic parlance has it, and as well from what common academic treatment would give it. I don't mean by liberalism the moral adventure of liberalism that I try to celebrate and present in my book, A Thousand Small Sanities. I don't mean, the subtitle is The Moral Adventure of Liberalism. I don't mean anything like simply the politics of the Democratic Party, though at its best, I hope that the Democratic Party in the United States, like the Labour Party in Britain or the Liberal Party in Canada, where I come from, and so on, still instantiates some of those values. I mean something much broader, more broadly available, a set of values and beliefs about the way we should conduct our social lives that are available to people of many styles and stripes of economic conviction and social and moral temperament. Liberalism in that sense is a set of intuitions and instincts about how we should conduct our social life. It's not a partisan identity that we have to have stamped on our card again and again. But I try in the book to offer this particular vision of liberalism because I thought it was overdue and essential. And the inciting impetus of the book, to use a term from the screenwriter's vocabulary, was the election night of 2016, when my then 17-year-old daughter, Olivia, watching Donald Trump's ascent to power, was, in her own vocabulary, freaked out by what she was seeing. Let me add immediately, she wasn't freaked out, or I certainly would not have encouraged her to be freaked out, simply by the oscillation of parties in power. The oscillation of parties in power, as we are reminded again this week, is an essential feature of liberal democracy. I wrote a comment, a kind of editorial for the New Yorker just last week, making the point that there's a deep tie between sportsmanship as a practice, shaking hands at the end of the game, and parliamentary procedure, liberal democracy. Exactly because one of the things we accept, both in modern sports and in modern politics, is the idea that the game will be played out to a conclusion. The conclusion may be surprising, and that there is a natural oscillation of winning teams, of triumphant parties. And part of the test of us as people is to not just accept, but to embrace that reality. So I didn't want her, or I wouldn't have allowed her, to the degree that a father can allow or not allow anything, to be upset about that. What she was traumatized by was the specter of a certain kind of predatory authoritarianism that I had warned her about coming to power. And we spent 2 hours walking round and round our New York neighborhood with my arm around her and her smartphone firing off the firecrackers of text messages from her friends. And I tried and failed to fill her mind and heart with the liberal humanist values that I had tried to raise her with, and that I had in turn inherited from my own father and mother. Having failed, I decided to write her a letter on liberalism, a letter to my daughter on liberalism, and that was essentially what this book became. It's a book that I hope, and certainly attempted, to make rich and dense with personal example. One of the things that I think academic studies of liberalism, I said that the journalistic use of liberalism is often too narrowly tied to a single political party, but the academic use of liberalism, if any of you have been to college, done political science, often overemphasizes, to my mind, the, if you like, the bureaucratic or procedural side of liberalism. You've all heard about the social contract and the thought in the 17th century of figures like Locke and Montesquieu, who emphasized the constitutional side of liberalism. That's something that had a huge effect on our founding fathers. How do you organize a government? And that's, of course, a crucial question. How do you organize particularly a democratic government? But I was moved and stirred more by the stories of men and women who had a liberal vision, and who tried to live it, not just in their politics, but in their lives. I have 1,000 small and large heroes in this book, running from everyone from the great philosopher John Stuart Mill and his passionate love affair with the woman he called his greatest teacher, Harriet Taylor, to Bayard Rustin, one of the great heroes of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, who was both black and gay and struggled for freedom and recognition in both ways, and organized the March on Washington, and who, Bayard Rustin, once I think gave the best, simplest definition of the dance steps of liberalism: constitutional procedures, nonviolent methods, democratic means. Those are the three key parts of liberal activism. But in trying to define liberalism more broadly, what I turned to was the conjoined, the equal, the simultaneous pursuit in liberalism, both of a vision of individual liberty, of the idea that all of us should be free to speak as we want to act as we want to, within the very broad constraints of personal violence and personal danger, that we should all be free to worship as we want to, that individual liberty is a crucial atomic force within a society, always to be encouraged, to be discouraged only in extremis and only when we absolutely have to. That idea of individual liberty being vital to liberalism, but also, and simultaneously, an idea of ever broader social equality. And I give, as an example, the sort of two pillars of liberalism. The two books that John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, I mentioned a moment ago, in the 1830s in London, began to author and collaborate on. On the one hand, Mill's great book on liberty, which is all about the demands and an insistence for the broadest possible range of freedom of faith, freedom of expression, and freedom of individual fulfillment of a kind we see today in the gay liberation movements of all kinds. That idea of individual liberty, as I say in Mill, and then Harriet Taylor's great book on the subjection of women from the same period and the same collaboration, which is all about the necessity of having a very broad program of political reform, which allows the subjected half of humanity, women, to finally be emancipated into full political and social and economic and indeed creative and artistic equality. So those two ideas, which are sometimes presented as though they're contradictory, of faith in individual liberty, a belief in ever greater social equality, are the two waves and impetus of the liberal movement as it begins in the 18th century, and our revolution in another way in the French Revolution, runs through the great programs of parliamentary reform in Britain and Canada, is vindicated in the most crucial way by the Civil War in the United States. Abraham Lincoln, of course, is the subject of another book of mine, and is one of the great heroes of liberalism, insisting that a country, a government so dedicated can stand against a slave power at that time. And that's my idea of liberalism, and that I think is the crucial moral adventure of liberalism, is the ever difficult but ever essential attempt to reconcile as best we can, and with all the moral energy that we can summon up, the demands of individual liberty with the demands of ever greater social equality and social reform. And against that form of liberalism, I offer, and this is, if I may say myself, the part of the book of which I'm proudest, I try to offer the most cogent and passionate attacks on liberalism that I could possibly summon up. On the one hand, the attack from the left, and on the other from the right. There's an enormous gulf and difference between leftists and liberals, and that's one of the themes of the book, though liberals and leftists often act in concert. It's one of the principles of liberalism that coalition building is essential to political action. But then I also talk a great deal about the right-wing attack on liberalism, what its sources are and what its arguments are, above all. And in essence, the left-wing attack on liberalism is an attack on the liberal faith in reform rather than revolution. And that's something that filled our ears and our minds just in the past year. It was present in the ever-going tussle between so-called centrists in the Democratic Party and the progressives, the leftists, the Bernie Sanders people, who felt that there was something fatally weak, fatally spineless, fatally ineffectual about the kind of so-called centrist liberalism that someone like Joe Biden represented, that Barack Obama had represented earlier, that what we needed indeed was not reform, but in the words of Bernie Sanders' own organization, my revolution, our revolution. We needed radical and revolutionary rather than incremental and gradual change. That's an endless argument between the left and liberals, and we saw it lived out in the primaries of the Democratic Party. And that's the classic left-wing assault on liberalism, is to say that the faith in incremental reform, the reliance on the idea of individual liberty, the absolute belief in the power of legislative, in the very broad sense, parliamentary politics, is mistaken. The leftist tells the liberal what we must have is radical and revolutionary change that reaches around and beyond ordinary political means for the necessary ends of egalitarian reform. The only way we can stop people from shooting black kids, the only way we can bring egalitarian medical care to America is not through reform, but through some kind of often ill-defined revolution. The right-wing attack on the kind of liberalism that I praise in the book and that I promote is instead not an attack on the liberal belief in reform, it's an attack on the liberal belief in reason. Liberals believe in a phrase, in reform through reason, in improving the world step by ameliorative step, and doing it by a process of political persuasion, of reason, of argument. And while recognizing that arguments have their limit and that reason is not alone what moves human beings, nonetheless, we believe it's the core of democratic debate in the power of reason and persuasion. And the classic right-wing critique, which has enormous power and cogency, as does the left-wing one, says that reason is not enough, that we can never try to make our lives on a purely rational, argumentative, persuasive basis, that that's a kind of cosmopolitan illusion, that our real identity as human beings is rooted not in the things we rationally persuade each other of, but in our irrational attachment to a clan, a country, a land, a history. That's the core belief of nationalism of every kind, from the most pernicious kinds that we saw in European fascism to the more benign kinds within which all of us live, that our profound attachment to a tradition and to a place is more important for us than our commitment to an endless set of rational arguments. I tried to put it in the book as succinctly as I could by referencing one of the great philosophers of conservatism, a Canadian philosopher, one who was at the same university, McGill, with my parents, the great Charles Taylor, is both Catholic and conservative in his outlook. And he emphasizes always that the question that liberalism has asked throughout history is usually, what do I want? It's also the great question of musical theater. Mary mentioned my great passion for musical theater, and I was lucky enough to actually have a musical of mine put on in Connecticut, in New Haven, at the Long Wharf Theater, a show called Our Table. It actually was called The Long Wharf, the most beautiful room in New York, but my name for it was Our Table. In any case, that's the question every musical comedy hero or heroine asks, and it's sort of the classic liberal question. What do I want? And Charles Taylor and the conservatives tell us, well, what do I want is a narrow, materialistic, hedonistic question to ask. All it tells you is about the personal pursuit of personal pleasure. The real question we should ask, that we do ask as human beings, is really, where am I? Where am I? Where do I sit in relation to other peoples, other clans, other cities? If I don't know where I am, I can't ask what I want, and that even the question, what do I want, is inexplicable, is without understanding where I am. That's the classic conservative critique of liberalism. And lest it sound terribly airy or abstract or philosophical, you only have to think about the politics of Brexit in Britain, the startling and dramatic divorce of the United Kingdom from Europe, to see the force of those arguments. That divorce was really conducted purely on those classic conservative grounds, saying where we are, who we are as Brits is far more important than any possible trading advantage we might get out of belonging to this larger anonymous cosmopolitan whole called the European Union. We are ultimately British. Our connection is to the British past, to the British future. We are part of a long island heritage, and we intend to remain there. I don't believe that was the right decision, but I certainly don't belittle the powerful emotional currents that drove that decision. So I hope you see all the ways in which the left-wing critique of liberalism, the dissatisfaction with too cautious reform, was still very much a living element in our lives, and indeed how much the right-wing critique of liberalism is still intact. Reasonable question, and I've rushed quickly through a complicated set of arguments and anecdotes and examples that I hope fill the book. The good question, I think, to ask is, where does that particular vision, where does that idea of liberalism stand now, a few days from Thanksgiving, a couple of weeks after what I think was the most momentous election in American history since the election of 1864. Some of you may remember from high school and college history that in 1864, the existence of the Democratic Union, the existence of the United States, was at stake. The war had been going very badly for the North. Lincoln's opponent in the election, McClellan, was running for the Democrats, was openly in favor of negotiated peace with the South that would allow them to continue their slave culture unmolested. And Lincoln expected to lose the election of 1864. Had he done so, we would not have had emancipation, or at least not for a very long time. We would not have had America. And let me add, because it's an important point, it was only the Union and Lincoln's victory in the Civil War that re-inflamed, remoralized, if you like, both the rebirth of the French Republic in 1871 and the great moves of parliamentary enfranchisement in Britain in the 1860s. Now, of course, it didn't do it alone, but had Lincoln lost the election of 1864, its effects not just on America but on the entire world and on the entire future of liberal democracy would have been profound and pernicious. And my deep conviction is that this election was the most important election since 1864 because, I say without hesitation or apology, we had in the Trump presidency, for the first time, not just in the history of America, but in the history of modern liberal democracy, history of liberal democracy itself, which is a modern invention, we had a political figure, a political leader, who was openly and unapologetically hostile to all of the basic tenets of liberal democracy, who openly and unapologetically admired single party autocrats like Putin, like Erdogan, like Orban, who were able and are able to rule essentially without opposition, either from another party or indeed from a media, from a free press, or for that matter, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, who Trump profoundly admired until he thought it opportunistic to turn on him after the pandemic began. Those were Trump's great heroes. That's Trump's model of leadership and of excellence, the idea of the all-powerful leader devouring all opposition and acting with absolute authoritarian flair and absolute autocratic certainty. We had never had before had a figure of that kind in power in the United States. And so his expulsion from power seemed to me utterly essential if the American experiment, in the words of that great musical, Hamilton, was to go on. And the result we got both vindicated, I thought, in many ways, the principles and premises of my book, and in other ways left them in doubt and forced me, in the healthy way that all liberal Democrats should always be re-examining their premises and their conclusions, forced me to re-examine some of my own. Let me talk about the positives I felt that I could take from the election in terms of my own political vision, my own political philosophy, my own particular form of liberal humanism, and then talk a little bit about the places where I believe that not only I, but the broader liberal vision is flawed or was at fault and needs to itself to engage in the constant liberal process of reform. The first thing I think that is true, and that I think is a positive truth about my vision of liberalism, which of course is I am merely a dwarf standing on the shoulders of giants from Benjamin Franklin to John Stuart Mill to Bayard Rustin and beyond, is that it was a vindication of an essential liberal principle, and that is pluralism is always better than purism. And it's better both ideologically and more effective politically. What do I mean by that? Well, exactly what we saw in the contest between the Sanders forces in the Democratic Party and the Biden forces. The Sanders forces, and I should add immediately that my children, or at least one of my children, my 25-year-old son, were very much committed to those forces, believed in purism of a kind. They believed in ideological purity. They were extremely suspicious of the classic, what they saw as the neoliberal compromise and coalition building of Biden's kind of liberalism, or for that matter, Barack Obama's. And they believe that far from reaching out to the unpersuaded Republican voter, what we had to do was motivate and inflame and move forward voters who previously had been so disgusted by the temporizing and the corruption of mainstream liberalism to come and vote. Their argument was simply that a lot of the youth and minorities would all come together to support Bernie Sanders, and we would not need all of those wishy-washy suburban moms. The liberal response to that progressive or leftist doctrine is that pluralism is essential to social change, that the only way we ever have historically made significant social change is through coalition building, is through putting profoundly different kinds together, if only for the purposes of one election, to pursue one common end. That was true certainly about the civil rights movement in the 1960s. I referenced it before talking about Bayard Rustin, and that was, in Dr. King's hand, a great moral crusade, certainly, an act of overwhelming personal, rhetorical fervor, but it was successful because Lyndon Johnson managed to build an effective, if briefly lived, coalition of Northern liberals, African Americans, self-interested Southerners. There were a few of them, just as you could peel off a few suburban Republicans, you could peel off then a few Southern Democrats who saw that the system of apartheid in the South could not persist. That was how the Civil Rights Bill and the Civil Rights Movement were able to pass from the street into the Capitol and eventually into law. And I believe that was shown to be profoundly true in the election. Joe Biden, who was widely considered a weakling, a spineless centrist, unable to inspire people, proved by the time we had finished counting all the votes to have done something extraordinary. He had pulled together with enormous temperamental acuity, if not with any kind of particular ideological explicitness. And I say in the book that liberalism of the kind I admire is primarily a temperamental activity. I mean by that it's not something that you can list in a set of ideological axioms. It's something that you feel your way through very much in the normal way that we feel our way through social life. We make our social lives out of coexistence and compromise necessarily, and the liberal vision is simply to take that form of coexistence and compromise within which we live our daily lives and apply it to our social lives as well. And Biden did that with extraordinary effectiveness. And one of the things you see that's already beginning to happen within the Democratic Party coalition, within the liberal coalition, is that people are tugging at each other, saying, we are the real heroes. It was African American women. No, it was white suburban women. No, it was the working class men who, in some numbers, Biden was willing to was able to pull back. No, it was really the collegiate class, that the real great divide is between the rural people with a high school diploma and college educated people. And the answer is all of the above. That's exactly the nature of pluralism. It was getting a little bit of all of those people into a coalition which might evaporate tomorrow, but which was potent and effective in its one essential cause of expelling Donald Trump from power. And it's a beautiful example of the power of pluralism, what just happened in our election. And let me add, because I referenced the degree to which the progressive, the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, with which I should add immediately, enormous ideological sympathy. I have been arguing for, and to the degree that a writer can fight for anything, fighting for national health insurance, national Medicare, Medicare for all, as Bernie Sanders would put it, for 35 years. I wrote the first piece in the New Yorker in praise of the Canadian system, having come from Canada myself, and enjoining Americans, arguing for Americans to embrace it. I did a debate with my dear friend Malcolm Gladwell, a fellow Canadian, 22 years ago in the Washington Monthly, again making the case for Medicare for all. So my ideological sympathies are certainly, in many respects, with Bernie Sanders, my feeling for what is right, but my temperamental sympathies are entirely not with the purist vision, but with the pluralist vision. And clearly, and I think it's one of the lessons of the election, purism not only often fails, it certainly would have failed in the most tragic and destructive way. And I think that Sanders and Warren supporters recognize that now. It was a skin of our teeth thing to pull off this essential act of expelling an autocrat, a would-be authoritarian from power. And only, I think, Joe Biden, of all the people who were out there, could have pulled it off. Pluralism over purism. And let me add, because it's an important point that I think is too easily overlooked. Bernie Sanders played a heroic role in letting that kind of pluralism flourish because he chose a path of silence, even when Biden and Kamala Harris were saying things that surely must have offended him, coming out against socialism, with Bernie a socialist. He nonetheless understood that his role within that broad and potent coalition was to prevent his followers and his forces from torpedoing the whole, because he recognized with great moral clarity that the necessity of expelling an authoritarian, Donald Trump, from power was greater even than his desire to see broadly egalitarian and indeed socialist policies put into place. And not only did that remind us that pluralism is a more potent force if we seek social change than purism of any kind, it also, I think, Biden's victory was a victory of centrism. Now, centrism is a thing that romantic radicals always despise and always put down. There's no worse thing you can call somebody on Twitter than a centrist. I'm called that myself. But I think that's a terrible misnomer because what's called centrism and the people who are called centrists very often are not people who are constantly trying to split the difference between opposing sides. I agree that that's an obnoxious trait. The ever running insistence that there's good on both sides, that the truth must lie somewhere in the middle between right and left. That is obviously not the case. It wasn't the case. I gave the example before of the civil rights movement, where all the good and truth lay on the side of those fighting for racial equality, and all the wrong lay on the sides of those who were impeding it. The virtue of centrism is not that the truth always lies in the middle, but that the center is the one place where everyone can come. I always think in my mind of the great agoras of Greek cities in the first abortive experience of democracy in the West, where people could pour into the agora in the center of town exactly because it was in the center. It remained a place for dispute and argument. It was central, but it wasn't centrist in that way. And that's my own vision of centrism. Centrism, properly understood, is not the spinelessness of liberal politics. It is the spine of liberal politics. And just as our spine bisects our body and gives it tensile strength, so our desire to come together in the center is a strength of a liberal party. And that's the sense in which I think we can ever vindicate centrism as a force, and I think it was vindicated here again. Incrementalism, a belief that we have to take things step by step, is another thing that I believe was vindicated as a liberal principle by Biden's victory. It particularly, when I think about the reality that incrementalism is not a good in itself, and I don't think any liberal believes that. It's a necessity of common action. As I said before, I feel passionately about national Medicare. I feel very passionately about gun control. I would love to see Canadian or Australian styles or regimes of gun control in America tomorrow. I don't want an incremental, but I recognize that it is not within my power. My ego is not the authority in the world, and that I will only arrive at gun sanity through a program of ever-growing remedial action, just as we arrived at an increasing end to murderous drunk driving through a similar kind of program. That's why I talk in the book and gave my book the title, 1,000 Small Sanities, because that's the way change happens. Incrementally, not because we don't want radical or significant change, incrementally, because we recognize that 1,000 small sanities are usually wiser and more effective than one big idea. And I could go on talking about the principles that I talk about in the book that I think were vindicated in the election to be more pugnacious. I certainly think that the undue faith in identity politics was very much torpedoed by what happened. I think it was quite clear that Democrats did themselves a disservice by emphasizing unduly the defund the police and all of those other things. Before I go to questions, let me just talk a little bit about the where I think the book, where the events of the election make me rethink some of the premises of the book. And that is exactly the right-wing attack on reason. Because one of the things we're seeing day to day now, and more broadly in the picture of everything that's happened, is the continuing power of the irrational in our lives. One of the things that we have learned again and again is that people do not live by and they do not vote by their interests, by their immediate economic interests, or even at times by their immediate health interests. We've seen that so powerfully in the politics of the pandemic, where so many Americans are willing to put their own lives and the lives of the people around them at risk rather than assent to what they see as a program of government control, rather than to submit to progressive tyranny or the tyranny of the state. They would sooner go without a mask and accept all of the risks that that entails, that the symbols of autonomy are far more important to them than the sanity of health. Let me add immediately that that's not an affliction only of one political side or one political party. All of us who are so-called privileged liberals make a choice very often to vote for taxes to be raised on us because we believe it's part of what we define as a common good. Our values are always more powerful, I think, than our interests. That's a classic conservative critique of liberalism, and I think it's been vindicated. Now, it's been vindicated, to my mind, in a very dangerous way in the last 2 weeks, because we see the insistence on kind of an irrational allegiance to Donald Trump, even after he's been defeated, even when the only arguments that can be mustered on his behalf are these mad, crazy conspiracy theories that imagine huge numbers of votes magically transformed by the long dead Hugo Chavez's computer program. But we would be making a mistake if we didn't learn, along with the power of pluralism from the election, if we didn't recognize as a sinister but as an essential force the continuing power of irrational politics, of identity, of clan feeling, all of those forces that continue to draw people to charismatic authoritarian leaders and to some vision, however obnoxious or pernicious it may seem to some of us, of common identity embattled against ever greater encroachments on individual liberty. I believe that liberalism has been vindicated exactly because pluralism, centrism, compromise look better tonight than they did 3 weeks ago. I believe that the liberal vision is in perilous danger exactly because liberals have still not entirely been able to either master or deal with the enduring power of the irrational in political life. Let me go to some questions now, if I can, and try to answer you. Let me go to my side here. I'll just run through these here. Someone asks me, given your perspective, i.e. the balance between personal liberty and the public good, how would you define the people who are COVID mask resistors? Are they in fact liberals? Moreover, how would you define libertarianism? Thank you. Well, that's a very good question. I addressed it a moment ago. Libertarianism is the ideology, very attractive in lots of ways, that takes one half of John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor's vision and forgets the other half of it. Takes the emphasis on individual liberty against the encroachments in the state, but forgets the liberal insistence on common action through politics for social equality. Liberalism affirms the individual, certainly, but it also has an essential role in believing in community and believing in the compassionate extension to other people. So, in fact, the non-mask wearers are people who are denying the social contract in that sense. There's no more powerful image of what the liberal social contract is than our wearing a mask. I wear a mask, you wear a mask. My mask prevents me from infecting you. Your mask prevents you from infecting me. Do either of us really want to be wearing a mask? No. We'll be delighted when the day comes when we can take them off. But for the moment, we understand that the essential compromise that we have to make in a plural society is indicated by our mask wearing. And those who don't want to wear masks are asserting their selfish self-affirmation at the cost of social good. The next question is, do you believe that a parliamentary system is on balance the better vehicle for achieving the aims of liberal democracy compared to the US constitutional system? Yes, in a word. As I say, I come from Canada, and I think that there's much to be said for the parliamentary system, not least because, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, when you lose a parliamentary election, you're out. The new guy or the new girl, the new woman comes in the next day, and we begin over again. If you might like, the democratic deficit, not Democratic Party, but democratic practice deficit in American constitutional arrangements is profound. We could go on talking about those. And I think even more, there's no other country in the world in which there would even be a question about the peaceful transfer of power as there is in the United States. Though I should add again that this is a horrible particularity of this moment of Trump. Next question is, if centralism, this is from Rick Robbins, if centralism is a place like the Agora, then what is a centrist? What does a centrist stand for other than a willingness to learn? What does he or she believe in? Well, exactly the point I was trying to make, Rick, and everyone else, is that no one self-identifies as a centrist. No one. It's like neoliberal. You always know when a term is not an entirely living term because no one uses it to talk about themselves. They use it to talk about other people. One can believe in, and this is the point I was trying to make, in the necessity for radical change while still recognizing the necessity of centrism, meaning simply the necessity of compromise and coalition to achieve the ends we want. We cannot expect a monopoly of reason. We can't expect a monopoly of opinion. And therefore, we all have to come together, if you like, somewhere in this city, to the piazza, to the agora, where we can all agree, at least for now, or at least begin to agree. So centrism is not an authentic ideology. I don't think anyone believes, oh, I'll be in the center on every issue. Centrism is a form of political pragmatism. Next question, from Leonard Rosenberg. Given that Trump received over 70 million votes, do you think that Trump and the conservative movement has any redeeming values? I certainly do. And in my book, I try and talk, as you'll see, and as I hope I've sketched quickly tonight, how sympathetic I am to most of the conservative intuitions and to conservative emotions. If you've read my work in The New Yorker over the past 35 years, you'll know that I've given enormously sympathetic accounts of great conservative thinkers from Michael Oakeshott to Edmund Burke and beyond. And certainly many of the core conservative beliefs, value of tradition, the power of family and community, an impatience with mindless reform, and a broader impatience, which I understand entirely, with what is called, rightly or wrongly, the politically correct left. These are all things that one can understand. What's horrific and frightening is the degree to which Trump, who is not a conservative in any sense, but is simply an opportunistic authoritarian, has taken over the conservative movement. And one of the great, I think, moral acts of the past 4 years has been all of those diehard, rock-ribbed conservatives from Mitt Romney to Bill Kristol to Stuart Stevens and Steve Schmidt, who have recognized the degree to which Trump is not a conservative, but is instead a frighteningly authoritarian opportunist, and have divorced themselves from that movement. The Lincoln Project may have been a tiny number of conservatives, but they have saved the honor of conservatism. David Frum is another. How do we have, Joe Loy asks me, how do we have this discussion when we aren't based in the same facts? The damage of conspiracy theories will be a thorn in the side of our democracy. I think that's certainly true, but here I'll be a bit of a dissident against the usual view. One of the things that's said again and again, as it was said by President Obama not long ago, is that we're all divided because we can't agree on the same facts. That seems to me a permanent feature of political life, certainly of American politics. People have amnesia, and they insist that there was once a time when we all coalesced around 3 television networks, 4 or 5 great newspapers, and so on, and we all had a common pool of facts. That's not the history that I see when I look at American history. People don't remember it now, but the great engine of right-wing thought in the 1950s was the sure conviction that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist. Certainly, John Kennedy was a communist. The John Birch Society and that kind of far-right movement, though purportedly banished from respectable conservatism by William Buckley and the like, were never really banished, and they provided, much as the Tea Party or QAnon does now, if you like, the flaming gasoline of the Goldwater movement in 1964. So I don't think it's accurate to say that we once shared a well of fact from which we drank like antelope, and no longer have it. When we have profound ideological and differences in values, we choose to pay attention to one set of facts rather than another. That doesn't mean that facts in any sense are relative, and it's our job as rational people to constantly re-argue the factual and empirical basis of reality. We can recognize that people will not agree on facts any more than they agree on values, and still insist that some versions of reality are more accurate than others. Mary Oppenheimer asks, given that Trump has demonized the free press, is there a way to increase trust and respect for journalists going forward? Again, the same question about separate worlds of information. The American media is in a crisis. There's no question about it. And it's a crisis formed in large part by economics, by the way in which the internet, with all of the good things it's given us, like my opportunity to speak to 216 of you tonight while sitting in my library in Manhattan, has also brought enormous damage because it has destroyed so many of the instruments of information, in plain English, the small local papers that were the lifeblood of American journalism. How we repair that is an ongoing struggle to which I have no easy answers. I know at the New Yorker magazine, the institution of which I'm a citizen, we have been heartened over the last 15 years by the degree to which our readers will support us even in the absence of traditional advertisers. But that's not a perfect solution, and those solutions need to go on. As I said before, to my mind, the problem is not so much that we're all in our little silos of information, but that we constantly have to re-argue reality. But that's the work of politics, and that will always be the work of politics. If you go back, I just did a long piece about Abraham Lincoln in his time, and God knows there was no commonality of fact between North and South, between pro-slavery and anti-slavery sides at that time. Lincoln's greatness as a politician, as a man, lay largely in his relentless rhetorical advocacy for the facts about American history and about slavery. Go back and read sometime his great Cooper Union address, the speech that made him president in 1860, and you'll see that it's a painstaking legalistic argument for the actual facts about slavery and government in America. The next question is there even the slightest possibility that the identity subsets of the Democratic coalition, with all of them, as you noted, claiming credit for Biden's election, will not weaken the Biden administration, lose the House in 2 years, and perhaps even lose the presidency in 2024? I am truly what one might call a remedialist when it comes to politics. I'm not a pundit. I'm not a politician. I'm an essayist who has dived into political waters exactly because of what I perceived and perceived in my daughter's eyes as the absolute acuity of the emergency that we were living in. So my view, to be perfectly blunt and perhaps wildly short-sighted, is that having expelled Trump, a would-be authoritarian, from office, if indeed we have, and I pray that we have, Daenu, as we say on Passover night, that would be enough. Not enough for all time, not enough permanently, but enough to have accomplished for now. And it's certainly going to be the case that one of the challenges for Biden and his administration is to keep together as best he can the coalition that brought him to power. But one of my core beliefs, and it's one of the core beliefs, I believe, of the liberal tradition, is that it's very, very hard to say what's good in the world, where virtue resides. It's why liberals are very skeptical of and impatient with grand utopian visions, because it's very easy to say what's evil in the world, what does us harm. We all know what's evil and destructive, even if we all have a hard time defining what's good, if indeed we all have to define the good for ourselves. So to my mind, being able to eliminate even for now, because everything is for now, everything has a short lifespan and will change in the future, that's good enough onto the hour. Next question is, religious freedom, from Roxanne, is a key tenet of liberal democracy. What do you think of Justice Alito's claim that religious freedom is under assault? I'm so glad you asked that question. It's one of the themes of my book, is exactly that the perpetual claim on the part of faith-based people and of religious people that liberalism is an intolerant creed is simply false. The truth is that it's only within the broadly tolerant societies that we call liberal democracies that we've seen the capacity of every faith to work out its own rules, to practice with its own freedom. Freedom of religion, absolute as we can make it, is not an enemy of religion. It's the best friend that religion can have because it allows for plurality of faiths, and it also prevents the insanely destructive and violent religious warfare that has so disfigured not just the history of Europe, but the history of mankind. The one thing that liberalism says is not that you should ever not be free to practice your faith and believe in your faith, but that you have to respect all of the other faiths that come along together. And you have to respect the idea that there is a public square, a public space, in which tolerance and pluralism will be the rule. If your religion cannot abide a broadly pluralist vision of the world, then indeed, liberal societies are not a place for you. But what strikes me is, when I go to Williamsburg on a Friday night, is how a liberal city like New York allows an incredibly broad range of religious kinds, not only to be tolerated, but to flourish in ways that they do nowhere else on earth. Pat Jenny asks, and I'm just going through questions here, they're all good questions. How do you reconcile California voters' 65% support for Biden, while at the same time rejecting 4 liberal ballot initiatives? A very good question. It's something that many people have pointed out, that it is telling that in Florida, which rejected Biden, minimum wage measure initiative passed, while in California, which embraced Biden by an enormous plurality, rejected an affirmative action measure. I think it's part of the self-correction that liberals are going to have to do for the next four years, or indeed eternally, is to ask if there is indeed the kind of broad sympathy that liberals or progressives at least tend to imagine with all the forms of racial essentialism that have become part of the story. I am something of a heretic because I find racial essentialism of all kinds obnoxious. Racial essentialism, the belief that there are inherent qualities to an ethnic or racial type, is the core belief of the right wing. It was the core belief that oppressed African Americans and Black people for centuries, that persecuted Jews and persecuted and massacred Jews for centuries more. And I am deeply suspicious of any of the claims of racial essentialism, whether they come from the left or the right. I believe with Dr. King in the necessity of the individual as the only meaningful element in a society. So there's clearly a place where liberalism and the Biden coalition will have much work to do. Someone asked me a good question. How would you critique Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail with its lack of incrementalism and dismissal of the fears and concerns of his white supporters? Every great movement for social change involves an important kind of marriage between the prophetic vision and the political vision. And the civil rights movement was not different. It was essential to have Dr. King speaking out against what he saw as the undue incrementalism of many of his liberal allies or would-be allies, which, remember, was an incrementalism that said we can put up with a little bit of persecution, we can accept a little bit of segregation, and Dr. King was saying, no, we can't. We have to have freedom and equality now. But it went hand in hand. With a commitment to the slow process of legislative change. That's why I mentioned and make into one of my heroes, Dr. King's great advisor and ally, Bayard Rustin, because it was Rustin, exactly with his understanding of the necessity of coalition building and incrementalism, who gave Dr. King's passionate and poetic and prophetic vision real barbed energy. It was Rustin who organized the March on Washington. He said once, with mischief but accurately, Dr. King is a saint, but he couldn't organize vampires to go to a bloodbath. Rustin was a great organizer. He understood the necessity of 1,000 small sanities, of 1,000 small sandwiches for the March on Washington, chartering buses, supplying food, all of that necessary, ugly, what I call rhinoceros work, as against unicorn work, of work. One of my heroes in the book, and you'll see I have a long essay about him in the New Yorker, is Frederick Douglass, I think the greatest American who ever lived, exactly because Douglass is both a prophet, poetic prophet, in his insistence not on graduated abolition, but on absolute abolition and on the equality of black and white. But he was also a brilliantly pragmatic politician who made a commitment, believe it or not, to the Republican Party, as it was then, throughout his life. I see I'm going very long, but let me answer two more. Let me answer a couple of more questions. It's a central tenet of the value system of liberalism, Richard asks me, that it can work against self-interest, or the diminishment of the question, what do I want? Is it a central tenet of the value system that it can work? Yes, indeed, I think it can. You know, if I can throw out one of my favorite examples of this, people, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, will always cite Adam Smith as the great prophet and father of the free market. But Smith is wildly misunderstood in many ways, because one of Smith's basic tenets was, and he wrote a book about this before he wrote on the Wealth of Nations, was that we can only move to free markets if we have broad social sympathy beneath it, that we have to have a commonality of values, and above all, a genuine form of social trust before free markets can work. If you don't have free markets, if you don't have social trust, what we now call social capital, you can't have free markets. And boy, is that a truth that's been vindicated again and again in the experience of Eastern Europe, Russia being a prime example of what happens to capitalism without social trust. It simply degenerates into kleptocracy. So yes, liberalism, by believing in the power of social sympathy, always tries to balance self-interest with the common good. It's a non-dramatic and a non-glamorous enterprise, but I think in an essential one. Let me just take one more question. Let me take two more questions, if I may, and then I'll let us all go to dinner at a home. Though these questions are fantastic. Jackie's son asks me both about climate change, but hasn't pragmatic centrism hasn't done much to mitigate the dangerous effects of rampant capitalism and stock market values in the U.S., creating a loss of this dissatisfaction and high inequity of the past 10 to 20 years. How would centrist liberalism, again, I reject the label of centrist as an ideological label. It's an instrumental necessity of living in a pluralist society. But how would liberalism potentially approach this huge issue in this country? Well, let me answer first pragmatically. The reality is that we're going to have to approach it the only way we can, which is through the process of persuasion and election, because there's not an alternative. One of the things that the tragic history of the 20th century taught us is that socialist revolutions fail. They failed everywhere they were attempted, and they failed in ways that were morally and practically horrific. Programs of social-minded democratic reform succeeded. They succeeded in Britain, they succeeded in Canada, they succeeded in the New Deal in America. So that's the reality of what we have. If we want to have a tolerant society, we have to accept that we can't get it all at once or ask for it all at once. If I can offer a practical solution to, or not a solution, but a proposal for how we deal with the problem of inequality, one of the most robust correlations in all of the social sciences is that between early education, pre-K education, and the reduction of social inequality. It appears again and again in country after country. If we want to reduce income inequality and social inequality in America, investing in early education is by far the most effective and potent way to do it. And then finally, someone asks me, so much that is happening now is unprecedented. With Trump refusing to concede and presumably squatting in the White House come January 20th and attacking democracy, is the arrest and removal of Trump and his enablers who have broken the law prior to the change ever a legal option and a viable recourse? How would this happen exactly? Well, I don't pretend to know how it would happen. I do recognize that tonight we are living in an extended emergency, that what Trump is attempting to do, though clownish on the surface and oafish in execution in so many ways, is a mad dagger directed at the very heart of democracy, an attempt to overturn the legitimate results of a free and fair election, as even his own employees have insisted, and they got fired for telling the truth about that, and has alarmingly, tragically, catastrophically, nonetheless enlisted large parts of the Republican Party along with him. It's clearly the belief of the Biden campaign and the Biden forces that we can, that the best way of handling Trump is not to get engaged with him. It is a little bit like the way parents are taught to deal with a tyrannical toddler who's having a tantrum. You don't get involved with it, you just walk away from it. I pray, I mean, really literally pray, that that is a wise policy and it isn't unduly tepid. But I think you're absolutely right to point out the gravity of this threat and the necessity of rising to the challenge that it presents. Though, as I say, it seemed clear that the Biden-Harris team believes that the way you rise to the challenge is not to engage with the clown. Let me ask, there's one question left. Let me answer that, and then I will run away. The size of the imbalance between those who have economic power and those who don't has only grown under 60 years of centrist liberalism. Well, we haven't really had centrist liberalism. Why are you so convinced that a radical, this is from Jamie Longy, progressive left-led democratic alternative would fail? I'm not convinced that it would fail. I think it might succeed, but it's going to have to get the votes to succeed. It's going to have to summon together exactly the kind of pluralist coalition that Biden was able to summon and that, for good or ill, Bernie Sanders wasn't. I'm all in favor, once again, not of radical change for greater social equality, Medicare for all, gun control where possible, and all of those things. But I recognize that it can't be achieved by faith and belief and self-righteousness. It can only be achieved by the extraordinary work of persuasion and potent compromise. Why don't I stop there? Mary, thank you for letting me speak for so long. Thank you all for your questions, and thank you all for coming.
I also want to thank everyone for participating, and also thank you, Adam, for your thoughts, for joining us tonight. I hope everyone has a healthy Thanksgiving, even if it probably won't be in the form that you ideally would like. But I hope everyone stays safe and healthy, and that we see you again next February with David Pogue. So Adam, thank you so much for your wisdom and your thoughts. I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you for having me, and I wish I was with you in Connecticut tonight.
Hopefully in a year or two, maybe we'll get you back and we'll be able to be together.
I would love that.
Okay.
Blessings to everybody, and everyone stay safe, please.